Thank you, Damien. Just please, everyone, let me know if there's any problems with hearing me or the technology or anything. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm sitting here at home on the unceded land of the Camaragal people of the Darug Nation. We do our work across the Camarae River on the land of the Wadawurrung people of the same nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present. The invitation for us to present in this forum, and thanks particularly to Peter Campbell and the Cranfield team for hosting this worldwide event. And apologies from Rachel Yuen-Collingridge. She's looking after sick kids. I will have to go and look after sick kids after I finish speaking, so I won't be able to see a lot of the rest of the papers. My apologies for that. It is what it is. Today, I want to give an overview of the work we're doing in the Forging Antiquity project. It is funded by 2 aligned Australian Research Council Discovery Project grants. And I give you an overview of the project team there, including Evie Handby, who'll speak after me on her own part of this work. I want to start by just sort of contextualizing the way we're approaching forgery in this project. And then I'll move on to some of our preliminary conclusions. And I apologize for the fact this is a bit of an overview and doesn't have as many conclusions as a lot of all the other work we'll be listening to today. So we start from the assertion that the significance of the past is nowhere more evident than when its authenticity is called into question. We ask how we recognize the quote unquote authentic past, and on what basis do we allow aspects of it to participate in the present? If we're assessing the past, how do we detect? How do we guard against forgery? And what does the forging of artifacts and the manner in which we detect them say about the importance of the past to the present? We try and ground our discussion of forgery in these big picture questions. I've put up these images on this slide because we would say that legal, religion, I don't think this is controversial, legal, religious, political, ethnic, and linguistic precedents are admitted to our understanding of the past based on assessment of authenticity and misrepresentation. From the claims of ISIS to be inheritors of the Abbasid Caliphate, to debates over the public commemoration of the Anzacs in Australia, that is soldiers from World War I, for those listening from overseas. Contemporary anxieties concerning authenticity of claims to the past play crucial roles in authorizing and stabilizing or deauthorizing and destabilizing the contemporary world. So frequently, such debates focus on the integrity of specific objects or documents, and thus the question of potential forgery. From the medieval Catholic Church's assertion of primacy based on the donation of Constantine, one manuscript on the top left here, no original manuscript, because of course it was a fake, to the alleged evidence for ancient belief in a married Jesus presented by the so-called Gospel of Jesus' Wife, bottom left, and throughout Built Man, Crystal Skull, Shroud of Turin, Shaker Barter forgeries, and thousands of other forgeries that I haven't illustrated on this site. Artifacts and texts have been loci for anxieties over authenticity. And so forgeries both undermine and support dominant institutions and practices. And they also unsettle the public's confidence in the past itself, and crucially, the disciplinary expertise of those who comment on it. The unmasking of forgeries, especially those that interact with national, ethnic, or religious narratives, erodes the popular perception of a single authentic past. And I mean this perception that exists in the general community, that there's one linear true past. Because that enables many popular traditions. And in the internet age, when access to information and participation in debate has become much wider, much more immediate, the public reception of the methods, results, and personalities of academic scholarship has become particularly prominent, especially in the case of accusations of forgery. So in the process, new questions have arisen about how we trust the past, as presented to us both by professional and amateur commentators, and to a large degree, this distinction has been eroded in the modern age, of course, and what constitutes the authority to participate in debates about the past. So we decided to address these large issues in which we're very interested by focusing on forged text on papyrus and related materials, written in Greek or Coptic, or scripts which are alleged to be those languages, and allegedly coming from mostly first millennium CE Egypt, or alleged to have come from there. And then. So this presents a controlled body of evidence because forgeries are as limitless as stars in the sky, but it contains a wide variety of types of forgery within that. And it enables us to have an opportunity to examine authentication practices within academic communities and the way that academic communities interact with.
Malcolm?
Yes.
There you are. Yeah.
Yes.
You hear it?
We've basically got about 4 key aims, and I'll step through these. We want to produce a list and typology of forged papyri. We want to investigate how papyrus forges work. We want to elucidate the social ecologies of forgery with respect to contemporary discussions, particularly the Antiquities trade, the colonial inheritance of scholarship in the ancient world, and public perceptions of scientific humanities and expertise. And we want to better characterize ancient inks and use that to better understand not only forgery, but our understanding of scribal practice and ancient writing in general. And so what we aim to do is to combine technical, scientific, and historiographic expertise to situate examination of forged papyri within a socio-historical perspectives on forgers and the roles they played in academic and public discussions of the past. And we want to move away from informed connoisseurship to a more rigorous analysis of the methods of forgery, particularly as regards papyri. This is a huge area we recognize. So I want to use the time today just to make a few points about what we've been talking about these last years amongst the team about each of these aims. So in terms of a list and typology of papyri, you can see our list on forgingantiquity.com/forgeries. It's a mapped, a mirrored Google sheet at the moment. Because we don't want to construct a huge database that we then can't maintain. The Google Sheet will always be there at least, but we can't guarantee that we can always maintain a fancy database. There, and our typology is online at the same website. So there's about 250 fake papyri in the list at the moment, and papyrus also covers ostraca, tablets, parchments, but there's many more we could add. For a start, there's a queue of about 50 that we're processing, but there's also hundreds, if not thousands, of more fake papyri out there. It depends in part on what collections have exposed to public view. So there are some biases inherent in what we're able to find. Just go through the typology that we've established. Firstly, there's pseudoscript. That is, these are papyri that are either in they're in simulated alphabets or adapted alphabets of some sort. They're not real letters mostly, and they're not real language. If they are in real letters, they're not in real language, but often they're not in any real script. They're attempting to present as real script. Now, what we find interesting is that the vast majority of the fake papyri that we find are these pseudoscript papyri. They're not any of the other categories that I'm going to outline, the 3 other categories. And so we have to ask why. So I think the reasons are two. One is that there was a vast production of these pseudoscript papyri in the late 19th and early 20th century, the sort of heyday of the creation of the great collections of papyri in Europe and North America. And a huge amount of these fakes were inventorized, taken into these collections, given inventory numbers, and then a lot of them show up in the online catalogs. So there's sort of selection bias in the number of these that present. But I also think there genuinely are more. There was a lot of people going around Egypt, like Lord Crawford here, who was there in 1899, who didn't read Greek or Coptic or any ancient language. Here you can see him thinking this one might be demotic, but of course it's just scribbles on a, something that's presenting to be a stelo. These are really the most easily diagnosed as fakes, and they're normally dismissed out of hand. But we think, what if we actually say these are relevant to the history of papyrology and the history of scholarship and the history of the relations between Europe, North America, and other countries, Australia and Egypt? Here's Carl Schmitt discovering an entire warehouse, a lager, he says in the German, where everything was fake. So Schmitt is there at the same time or a bit later. So you can see just how prolific the production of these was. So we say that bad fakes are important to examine, and Evie Hanby has taken this further in her doctoral thesis. And we particularly say these type of fakes are important because they're made by Egyptians, because they're made by people such as Huffer from Harwa near Medinat El Fayoum in the late 19th and early 20th century, who just forged hundreds and hundreds of these texts and all sorts of artifacts. And these fakes allow us to see the Egyptian agency in the Western rediscovery, if you like, of Egypt. And here I'd cite the work of Osama Ali Gad, and as well as his colleagues in the Everyday Orientalism Collective, that is attempting to help us understand the Egyptian role and also the removal of Egyptian agency in scholarship on Egypt. And we think that examining these fakes and examining people like Huffer's production of them helps us understand the relationship of Egypt to their own. Fascinating, and we like to do a typology of them. Okay, so quickly the rest of the typology. Composites, where you take some original papyri and make them into a one new papyrus that isn't any of those. Copies of existing texts, where you might take a part of the Gospel of Matthew or of the poet Bion and copy it out. And compositions, where you create an entire new fake text and copy it onto an ancient, here, ostracon. So that's our typology. So secondly, we're interested in how forgers work. Previous research focuses very strongly on forgeries and forgers, but we want to contextualize this in wider phenomena involving the market and the academy. And we concentrate here on master manuscript forger Konstantinos Simonides, active in the 19th century for an unknown amount of time because he keeps he faked his own death and revised his own birth date repeatedly. And he has about nearly 45 papyri in Liverpool mainly and elsewhere that we've examined. He's not only the best documented example of a papyrus forger, because we've got so many of his papyri, but also countless medieval and Byzantine and manuscripts, inscriptions, and other texts that he forged, paintings, but also a huge amount of documentation, including letters by him, enables us to position him, and here's where our second sort of theme comes in, as a social ecology of forgery, as a Greek in the early days of Greek independence, aggressively asserting the primacy of Greek knowledge and wisdom and the Greek manuscript tradition, and fighting to be taken seriously in European academia. So it's a story of the outworkings of colonialism and its intersection with academia. And it allows us to see, as does the work of people such as the Huffer of Harwa, of forgery as an act of creative decolonization. So when we talk about the social ecologies of forgery, of course, we're deeply interested in the antiquities trade and the illegal trafficking of artifacts, and in the ethics of the collection of artifacts. We have our own ethics policy online at markersofauthenticity.com, and that's a dynamic document that we evolve as our work progresses. But crucially, in our work on the ethics of the antiquities trade, of our relationship with the past, of the centering of our past, and I'd like to cite here Lauren Dundler's PhD thesis, now completed. We don't center forgery in our engagement with that issue. Mainly because we're not treating forgery, we're not analyzing forgery as a crime, but rather as a dynamic part of our understanding of history. And by our, I mean humanities' understanding of history. That's because if we treat forgery only as a crime, then we miss the creative and vital role that forgers play in the history of academia and in the history of generating our understanding of the past, but particularly in the history of academia. And this is not only because techniques of authentication often, or normally almost, are invented in response to forgery, that is, fakes drive fields forward, but also because forgery can be an act of creative decolonization, participating in the creation of history with often an explicit anti-colonial agenda, say in the case of Simonides. We can't tell in the case of people like Huffer of Harawa because we don't really know what they thought. So we need to treat ancient documents and modern forgeries as part of a single spectrum of human activity, encompassing scribal practice, cultural transmission, and the creation of the authority to authenticate. And by analyzing these together, we restore historical context to the technical examination of the production and detection of forgeries, and better understand the cultural practices and the assumptions which generated them. So finally, what about public perceptions of scientific and humanities expertise and what we mean by this? There's a picture of mid-19th century microscopist Henry Dean, who worked on the Simonides papyri. For instance, he's an incredibly important figure in our story in terms of 19th century science. Well, we'd start from the observation that the Academy is deeply complicit in questions of forgery and the antiquities trade. I don't think this is news to anyone on this Zoom or in the room. And it needs to police its own practices in terms of interactions with the market and the past, and its exclusionary practices in terms of what voices the Academy, writ large, allows into these discussions. We observe too that systemic vulnerabilities in the antiquities market, also no news to anyone here, and in systems of authentication have ensured the persistence of forgery as a problem. Technological interventions, quantitative authentication techniques, for instance, have been less successful than media promotion have suggested, and that, again, no news really, interdisciplinary approaches which fully incorporate the full range of expertise, including humanities and social science expertise, are necessary. And we analyze this via the work of Henry Dean on the Simonides papyri, but actual present-day examples are legion. Gospel of Jesus' Wife, for instance. So we examine this when we talk about our investigation of papyri and their inks, mainly with X-ray fluorescence, but also with other quantitative techniques led by Damien Gore and our PhD student Arzak Mohammed. I want to close by talking not only about the authentication of manuscripts, but about authenticating the narratives of the collection history of papyri, which are used to justify their sale in the antiquities market. And thus they obfuscate their status as looted or faked objects. Now, everyone here will be aware that the faking of provenance is as large a problem as the faking of artifacts, and potentially a larger problem. So we thought, okay, so it's quite difficult actually to determine fake scientifically sometimes, precisely because you can fake a patina, you can fake ancient ink, you can use an ancient stone or a bit of papyrus, and if you have the right ink and the right patina, you can write on it, and it may be almost undetectable. It is, of course, detectable in many cases, but often it's like science writ large, if you like, capital S, doesn't provide the certainty that media promotions might suggest. So we started from the fact that as the once totally unrestricted trade in papyri from Egypt becomes progressively restricted by international conventions and Egyptian law, what a lot of people have turned to is deconstructing mummy masks, that is destroying mummy masks, mainly from the Ptolemaic period, to recover the papyri that was used in them, to make the cartonnage, when Egyptians stopped making coffins out of gold, basically. So this not only provides a way to recover papyri, which can be sold for 7-figure sums, but also, and I think this is crucial, it provides a convenient way to disguise the collection history of papyri, which may not have been discovered legally, or they might be fake. So outside of the fact that this technique of making mummy masks ended with the Roman conquest of 30 BCE, although see more recent work which suggests it may have survived into the early centuries of the Common Era, we wondered if there was a way to more objectively test if papyri had come from mummy cartonnage. So we took the 600 papyri in the Macquarie University collection, all acquired on the Antiquities market since 1970. So we hold our hand up about that. And looked at, and a huge amount of which came from mummy cartonnage. And we looked at those, many of which contain traces of gesso on the papyrus, which are clearly the result. This calcium deposit is a result of the mummification of the cartonnage process, where the papyri is stuck together. And then we looked under XRF at those which were said to come from cartonnage, but contain no such visible traces of gesso. And we looked bottom right at all the calcium that's visible and under XRF, but is not visible to the naked eye. And we wondered if this hypothetically full study to be done, of course, might potentially provide a means of testing the dealer narratives, where people say that when people are trying to hide within a lot of cartonnage texts from later periods, or fakes or looted papyri, inside larger lots of papyri, which are said to derive from this. So we need to do a lot more work on this. We need specifically to be able to test industrial cartonnage, texts from later periods that are from, say, papyri, cartonnage used to make book covers. But this is an idea of where we think we might be going. I've talked for too long already. Thank you so much for your attention today. Thank you on behalf of the team. Thanks always to Ashley Cook at World Museum Liverpool, and thank you to all the team for their contributions, and particularly Rachel